Okay. So now also a repeated welcome to everyone to this Festival Ideas of Conversation with Tim Etchells, called Text in Landscape, which is part of Corridor of Light. Before we start with a bit of introduction, a little bit of information on housekeeping. So the event is being live captioned automatically by Zoom. So if you want captions, you can get them by clicking on the CC button on the menu on the bottom of your screen. And if you have any difficulties accessing that, you can let us know in the chat box. You are also free to use the chat box for some kind of in-between communication. And we will also have questions later, for which we will encourage you to use the Q&A box, which is also on the bottom of your screen. So after that, I want to warmly welcome Tim Etchells. My name is Sabina Sabolovic. I'm a member of curatorial collective, What, How, and For Whom, which was established in Zagreb many years ago, late 90s. And we've been working together there. And now for the last 2 years, again, as a collective, we are running Kunsthalle Vienna. I guess that most of you here don't need a special introduction to who Tim is, but I will still just do a very, very kind of short intro. So Tim is an artist and writer based in UK. He has worked in a variety of contexts, and he is, of course, very well known as the leader of performance group Forced Entertainment. And also Tim's work has been kind of strongly collaborative in kind of wide options and versions of media, just as his work is also happening through them. And also Tim is currently a professor of performance and writing at Lancaster University. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
So I had a privilege to collaborate with Tim on quite a few occasions, both showing his work in exhibition context, also showing some of the solo performances within the exhibitions. But I also want to stress that I'm also here kind of purely as a fan. I'm a big fan of Tim's work, and also especially his neons and drawings inhabit both my desktops and walls. And then also, not surprisingly, when we were started running Kunsthalle Wien, we also commissioned the neon work from Tim, which is now still, we kind of can't let go at the entrance of Kunsthalle in Vienna. So make sure to come and see it if you stop by there. And we'll also show you that one when we show you some more works. But today we are gathering on the occasions of Tim's most recent neon work, which has just been put up in Manchester within the Corridor of Light event. And we, of course, we will make sure to also show you that one and talk about it a little bit more in depth. So this was enough of introduction, and let's finally start. But I think also might be nice to really start at the beginning. So Tim, can you tell us a bit, I'm curious, how did you get interested in the format of the text-based neons? I would also be curious which was the first one you did and when.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what comes first is that I was, for as long as I can remember, I've been working with language, and specifically, I think for a very long time, I've been obsessed by and interested in fragments of language. And I've been keeping a notebook since I was more or less a teenager, and I was collecting, short phrases or sentences or things that I would write or overhear, or that I would copy from books or from newspaper, or more recently from internet or from movies. Just stuff, and I've been collecting that material and working with it in lots and lots of different ways, to try and sort of put it into different kind of projects and into new contexts. So, but as far as the neons go, it's interesting. I was thinking the other day, there were actually a couple of early forced entertainment performances. One in 1987, um, basically like the fourth show we made, and then another one maybe a year later, something like that, where we used neon as a kind of element of the stage construction, and we toured with it, which is not very easy to do. But a piece called 200% and Bloody Thirsty had a neon at the back which said 200% and Bloody Thirsty. It was on a kind of billboard of a blue sky. Um, so that, in a way, that was the first one that I was, connected to. But in terms of the art practice, I think the first one I made was in 2008, and I made three that year, which were shown in Sheffield, in Art Sheffield, um, and yeah, and then those same pieces were shown in a number of different places and are still shown in different places. So that was the beginning, and I think the desire was to, I think especially in that moment, was to explore the fact that you could be in a different kind of dialogue, in public space, with those works. That was the draw. I was used to working in performance space or in galleries or whatever, but that was in a way the draw was trying to think about ways to open something in a different kind of context.
You already mentioned, Tim, that somehow you are always looking at these fragments of text from different sources. But can you tell us a little bit more about your approach to the text? So in terms of like, how does this process of like, choosing what goes on there, and are there kind of particular lines? I know some are quotes, some feel somehow more random, and also maybe to also say a little bit like, what's the desired impact, if I may say so, in kind of finalizing the choice of the text?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of changes, I think, from piece to piece, from project to project. But I know that I think one thing that they have in common is there's a desire to sort of open up a space of dialogue and reflection with people who see the work or read it or experience it. So I think I'm always looking for phrases which either on their own or in the context, a particular context, that they open up a question. Often the works they seem like statements. It's quite rare that there's one that's actually a question. They seem like statements or images or something, but they are in a sense questions because because something isn't specified, and I think that's a through line as well in the pieces, that very often what's not been said is as important as what is said. So as a viewer, you're left with this sort of job of figuring out what might be being referred to, or trying to imagine different forms of in which the phrase could be sort of understood. I mean, so for example, the very first work was said, "Wait here, I have gone to get help." So it's a very strong proposition. It's got quite a narrative sort of thrust to it, but you don't know who's speaking, and you don't know who they're speaking to, and you don't know. I mean, they seem to be speaking to you if you're reading it, but you don't know what the circumstances are. You don't know when this message was left. It could have been, 5 minutes ago. It could have been 5 years ago. You don't know what the situation that calls for help is, whether it's a good idea to wait or not. So there's so much that's not known, but there's something that's really known, which is somebody has supposedly gone to fetch help. Um, so it's this sort of balancing act between what's stated and what's not stated, and because there's something unresolved in that, I think you read that work, and it's true for a lot of the other pieces as well, and you're immediately sort of in something, but you're also immediately not sure, and the not sureness is the thing that's sort of generative, and I think that's the thing that ties all of the work together, is that it produces something of a kind of eventhood. There's the sort of moment of, oh, what shall I do with this? That's what I'm sort of chasing. Even the form can be quite different linguistically. They're not all so narrative as that, but they do all try to produce this opening. That's the big connection, I think.
Is the ambiguity, I'm also curious, important in terms of to somehow, how would I say, give them a different voice in quite often still the intensity of public space? I mean, we are told what to buy, what to listen, how to behave. So somehow also it feels to me that their ambiguity also maybe frees them a bit. I don't know whether this is something that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, I think. I mean, there's two things about that. One, one that there's a sort of there's often a kind of ambiguity, and maybe even a sort of ambivalence. Like, it's not sure if what's being announced is a good thing. There's something uneasy. Help needed to be fetched. There's a question in that which is a little bit uneasy. Why did we need help? So that's important. And the other thing about the ambiguity, I think, in relation to public space, is that it gives them a kind of porousness, and that's something when I show some images a bit later on, I'll refer to this specifically. But this idea of porousness, and the idea that you can place the same work in a number of different contexts, and in a sense, wherever you put it, it activates differently. Both the language starts to mean something different, but also it speaks to and activates different things in the landscape itself. So depending on where you put it, and I think that idea that the work is porous to context, and that comes from the ambiguity, and it's also porous. I mean context in the sense of landscape, but also in the sense of social context. But also it's porous personally, so that for any individual, we're all carrying stuff around with us, narratively, emotionally, socially, politically, and the works try to, in a sense, create a palimpsest that sort of opens to that, and people can and do bring personal stuff in there because the work is porous in that sort of way. That's the desire, anyway.
You already kind of mentioned now when you were describing that also you are interested in this action, in this event that somehow happens when the viewer confronts them. I'm, of course, especially interested in that moment in terms of, all of your work in the performative arts. So somehow, can you situate these works a little bit within your performative practice? Is there links? How do you see them?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I work in so many different areas, but uh, I realized that maybe a very fundamental understanding for me, or a way of thinking, it comes from performance, which is, I suppose in performance you're always thinking about this moment of encounter, the sort of moment of triangulation between the stage, if you like, the performing body person, and the public, the spectators, the audience. Um, and of course, in performance, that's a sort of very lively and dynamic meeting. And it's only in that meeting that the work really happens, in fact. You do all the preparation, but as much or as little as you want to do. But there's this sort of dynamic moment of encounter, which is live and has a certain kind of electricity, social electricity in it. Um, and I realize that I think about uh, everything that I do in those terms. Even if I'm writing fiction, I'm thinking about the sort of live moment of a reader encountering the text in a book or on the internet or wherever they're coming across it on their computer, um, or I'm thinking about the moment where a work in a gallery or a work in public space has that kind of opening to the presence of another human being and the liveness of the transaction that takes place there. So of course, it's normal in performance to think about that live moment, but maybe less. I'm not sure. Maybe less common to think about it in terms of literature, for example. But it seems to me to be, well, for me, it's a really useful way to think about, for example, the relation between the page and the reader, and that there is this dynamic exchange. Um, the page, of course, is a fixed object. The neon is by now, it's a sculptural object in public space. But there is still this live moment of exchange and triangulation, and that is very fundamental to how I think about the works. That they're sort of active gestures in a social and semantic sort of flow, rather than fixed objects that have a meaning all on their own. They don't really understand that way of thinking, I guess.
I'm also a little bit curious about, the commissioning process, because of course, in order to put them up, I guess it's always like an institutional invitation, whether it's an institution who wants them more personal, permanently, or a festival or whatever. So how does it work? Do you kind of are offered a space, or do you have some, kind of requirements? How important is this, also in this triangulation that you were talking about? How important it is for you, like the position from which the viewer will, access the work? How is it visible, from which perspective? So how does this kind of negotiation of actually deciding what is put where work for you?
Mm. I mean, sometimes it's very specific in the sense that somebody, an institution or organization, festival, curator will come with a very particular location in mind and say that they would like to show something new, to commission something for this particular place. And sometimes it's much more open in the sense that there's an invitation to an institution or to a city, but the location is not clear. But I would say an important thing for me is trying to narrow down locations so that I have a sense of where a work might want to go. And that's partly practical, just in terms of how big does it need to be. Does the architecture demand certain things in terms of the arrangement of the text? If you've got a really long wall, or if you've got a tower, the possibilities are physically sort of inscribed in a sense by architecture or by other elements of the environment. So I'm kind of keen to work, sensibly with those things, or not sensibly, to work with them. Um, and of course, as well, particular sites will sometimes have historical or cultures of use that I'm keen to draw on and to think about when I'm presenting an idea. So yeah, there's a sort of narrowing down maybe, and I could say there's something about looking for spaces where I do think there's an uncluttered, clear view to the work, where it has some sort of the work will have some sort of, I don't know, visibility or authority in relation to the landscape and how one encounters it, and definitely thinking about those things. There's always different solutions are possible, but I'm definitely sort of tuned to that. There's some practical considerations about the lovely bridge or the lovely station platform that the railway control. Then you won't be able to use it probably because the railway probably won't let you. Speaking from experience on two projects this year, the railway are not really very happy to engage. So there's some practical things like that. And then, in terms of developing work, I mean, generally what I do is, I spend some time then either via site visits or via, reading and trying to learn a bit about history of places and thinking about the culture of use in a place. Trying to find angles, by which I could approach a particular site, and sometimes that's really has got historical sort of grounding. Other times it's more playful in a visual way, or maybe there's an idea that seems right for whatever reason. And I generally, in terms of a process, would come up with 3 or 4 possibilities probably that I'd want to talk to curators about. I think because I always feel like mostly people that one's working with have an understanding of the context, and they're also sensitive to maybe what they're trying to do in an exhibition context or whatever, that I'm keen to engage with that. So often the final choice for a piece out of a number of options will be a kind of dialogue. Sometimes, I definitely have done projects where I do 4 or 5 thoughts. Conversation then is, none of these are quite right. We need to push a little harder, or maybe there's something we're missing. I'm really open to that. I like it as a way of sort of interrogating what I'm doing. So it's always a dialogue in a sense. And I'm much happier working in relation to a specific site, even if I know that work will then go somewhere else, which it very often does. But it's something about that dialogue kind of process that's sort of important for me in terms of developing a work. Like, I like to know where something's going, basically. That helps.
I think maybe now would be a good moment that you also show us some of the works that you've chosen for the talk, and then of course we can come back to some of them.
Yeah.
And I have some more questions, and I think that also would be nice, of course, that you pause at the moment of the newest neon, which was the occasion for the talk, so that you tell us a bit more about that one also.
Sure, I will do. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So this is the first piece that I made, as I was saying. I'm going to spin through these fairly quickly, and I'll just say a couple of things about them. So, this idea of a sort of strong proposition a narrative proposition in this case. Um, this was a similar sort of has a similar dynamics from the same time. Um, and these are both shown in Durham at Lumiere in the UK. But sometimes it's this is a much more recent piece, larger scale, less narrative. This is obviously a quotation, and it was sort of relevant because it was in Hanover at the Kunstfestspiele, and the location is where Leibniz was living and working. So it was a quotation from him. This is something which I was thinking about earlier. So this idea of porousness to context. This is a work, one of the early ones that's been shown in a lot of different places. This is Blackpool in the north of England, and this is 2016, I think. So around the time of the Brexit vote, and it sat in Blackpool with a really amazing sort of resonance at that time. It was pretty strong, and you felt like it was, I think, speaking to the very particular political slide that we were in at that time, and still are in. This was at the Grundy in Blackpool, but then this. Sorry. Okay. Go back. Pause. Okay. This is the same piece, the same year, but at Bloomberg Space in London. So it's the sort of gallery of Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, financial institution, So in the same year, this had a very different sort of resonance, putting this work in that particular place. It seems to be, more about money, and the crash, which is still resonating. Then this is another place. This is in Germany, in Mainz, and this is in Lisbon, on the side of the National Theatre. And I got great email from people who'd seen the piece in Lisbon and had been told by a tour guide that the Inquisition used to have their headquarters in Lisbon here.
Wow.
Was the piece about that? And I was like, well, not for me, no. But if you're thinking about it, it's not wrong to be thinking about that. It's kind
Tim,
of quite
that's
hard.
really truly open for interpretation. That's nice.
There's always something to forget or to want to erase, I suppose, depending on what you bring to the table. So it does have that possibility. Yeah. So it's interesting for me when work gets sort of moved to different places and it opens in different ways. I'm just going to spin through a few things. Just different context, Warsaw now. And sometimes there's a very kind of concrete attempt to deal with the particularity of the location in sort of visual and sort of environmental terms. So this is a gallery vitrine where I show in Basel, and it's got this property of being a sort of glass box, basically, with all these pillars. So I thought about this work in relation to the environment, because it has this quality of being a place that you can sort of see through. So it sort of, I'm interested in the way that the work stops being about just the semantics of the phrases, if you like, and more about the sort of visual and sculptural dialogue with location and with environment. Start a revolution, revolving around a bandstand in Norfolk. This again was, it's commissioned for this location. So definitely an attempt to sort of play with that place. And then these works that sort of more play with disrupting the semantics of the language. I'm just going to spin through these and not say anything. And this is another piece that we showed in Vienna, of course. Yeah. Where again, there is a semantic content, but there's also this attempt to disrupt and play with that, or double down on that, by creating this sort of visual noise with the colors and the reversing of the letters. This is a work that takes a quotation from James Bridle's book, New Dark Age, which is about the internet and algorithms. And the quotation is, for everything that is shown, something is hidden. And basically only 50% of the letters are illuminated. So it's only by going close to the window and reading the unilluminated letters that you can sort of unlock the piece. And I really loved the idea that in this South London, public space, there was a sort of, in a sense, like a nonsensical neon. So there is of course there's an allure to putting these phrases which have a great kind of resonance, or try to open up to a sort of dialogue with people. But I also did really love the idea that we'd managed to illuminate this nonsense of letters in public space for a few months, which you could then dive closer to and read. Not neon, but public space, Times Square, and these are video works where a set of phrases are melting. Letters are made of ice. And again, it's that sort of tension between the semantic properties of the texts, and then this sort of pull towards a sort of abstraction, or to work with them as non-semantic materials. So by the end is just water. Recent Kunsthalle.
My favorite.
Yes. I mean, it's great, and it's been there for, is it nearly, it's
2.5 years.
Blimey, I was going to say.
And I think
years,
that there is a letter in your mailbox asking for a bit more. So we are obviously having a hard time to get rid of it and to lose it. Yeah. What I think is also really nice in a way, that in institutional context, I mean, at least for us, it was also interesting somehow how you place it and what position do you give it. For us, it was interesting that it's kind of, the work is above, the name of the institution in a way. And also, I think that there is also always then kind of a very interesting relationship developing, within the institutional, how would I say, position, and maybe some value systems and sense of direction. And somehow the work then, especially for people who come back to it a lot, also gets a bit of that context. But I guess this is also what you've been talking about, that like different knowledge also gives it a different reading, of course.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think it's also a work that has an obvious sort of proposition, but it's also an obvious proposition that very quickly becomes a question. What do we mean by being free? What kind of freedom? What kind of songs are we talking about? It opens up a lot of uncertainty whilst appearing to sort of declare something quite, sort of straightforwardly. I think I'm really happy with it as a piece that sort of sits above the entrance to something, and in a sense floats its own thoughts and its own question in relation to the contents. I mean, this interesting. The work always, in a sense, is a label. Wherever you put it, it captions what you're sort of looking at in a way. I'm fascinated by that. Okay, I'm trying to move along, but it's not succeeding. Why not? I don't understand. Where are we? We're here. Go here. It's not letting me go there.
I promise I didn't do any witch work on this photo staying frozen.
That's very strange. I'm going to stop sharing just for a second.
Okay.
And see if I can move it along in the privacy of my own home.
Okay.
That's very weird. Says thank you for your patience while we are retrieving your images.
Okay. Maybe while we are retrieving the images, one thing that you now mentioned, and this was also in my question, you mentioned the word label and somehow how it's, kind of positioned within this context. But I'm also curious about mediation of the works, because as far as I got it, there is never, how sometimes for public works, you have a little plaque and then it's not only the title, but there is, a little bit of like kind of giving you a context of it, or the author's voice is present. Do you ever do that? Are you kind of ever interested in like also leaving your view to it, or you want this, how would I say, openness and ambiguity to be total?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to just open the screen share again. So this is the Pompidou Center in Paris with another new work, Qu'y a-t-il entre nous, more or less what is between us. It's interesting, they're using the work as a sort of frame on a set of public discussions which will take place over the next several months until till February next year, with artists and philosophers and so on. And I did a sort of initial contribution to that discussion, but I'm, in a sense, for me, the important part is the question. I was not really inclined to help them fill in the answer to this. For me, what's important dynamically is that it's a question. So I'm usually pretty reluctant to. I can talk about what I think the works start to flow to, what they energize in the mind and in the conversation. But I'm a little bit reluctant to sort of nail them down, because in a sense all my work is about trying to make these extremely precise tense machineries, in language. So the idea that I would sort of then unravel that is never very appealing. Another shot of Pompidou. Just great to be able to realize something on this kind of scale. We were talking earlier about the pigeons, and as a sort of active force in the landscape, which is kind of great. This is Derby. This is yesterday in Derby. It's a very dynamic sort of city centre, quite run down part of the city centre, but great for sort of being in the thick of things. Sometimes the works really feel like they're in some quite aesthetic ground, away from the sort of hubbub, and this is a work that's just sort of landed, in a very lively and fluid part of town in a great way. It's really doing some nice stuff. And then finally, we're at Manchester, and Manchester. I'm going to go back. we looked at a number of different locations, and this was the one that I think I felt early on was the most likely, and also the sort of that gave the clearest sort of indication, in a sense, for a work. And I did a lot of thinking about bridges and about bridges. It's on a pedestrian bridge that isn't used. About bridges as a means of connection between one place and another, and yeah, other thinking around bridges, and like thinking about language that connects to bridges. And then I also just was thinking about this idea of being above things, and my mind, sort of went to this particular phrase: "Things are up in the air, everything's up in the air." And I suppose it chimed with a couple of things. One was just this thing about literalness. Like, I think there's often a way in which I like to make the text sculpturally, formally, visually, do what it's saying. So Start a Revolution goes around the bandstand. For everything that is hidden, for everything that's shown, something is hidden. Half the letters are hidden, and so on. So there's this optical illusions, political delusions, poetical confusions. The colours are confused, reversal of the letters, and so on. So there's this sort of sense in which the language starts to enact what it says. So you get this sort of doubling down on the content, which also becomes a kind of question. So here, the idea of everything up in the air, raised up in the air, and the big question was how high off the bridge parapet could we go? And initially, I think the drawings came back from the engineers that it could be, 50 centimeters above the parapet, and I was like, can we go to 80, just because I would like it higher.
Do what it says. Okay.
Yeah, we need to do what the language is telling us to do. But there's that, and then of course, I was thinking about the metaphoric, or the idea content of this, the idea of a moment in time, or the state of things being in flux. And again, post-pandemic, post-Brexit, into Brexit now. Post-pandemic, it's not even post-pandemic, pandemic.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this was an optimist moment saying that, yeah, I'm afraid.
No, I don't know where I've picked that language up from. It's not how I'm thinking, I have to tell you. Latest phase of the pandemic, which is the denial phase. Yeah, this moment of uncertainty, and all of the other uncertainties that we're sort of navigating right now. I like it as a sort of, it's a description of that moment. It's an invocation of a certain kind of moment of flux. I also sort of like it as the idea that what it might be doing is summoning something. When you announce something, if it's got that form of the caption or the imperative, it's got this sense of, yeah, let's do that. What if everything was in flux? What could we do then? In a different way. Yeah, so it's doing those two things. It's doing this very literal thing, but it's also floating this idea of change and possibility in uncertainty, which I think in the middle of a city right now in the UK and many other places, that's a good thing to be invoking. And I think it does have this great dialogue with the daily business of the city. People are jogging by or driving to work or walking from one thing to another, and there it is. And it just, I like that it floats this temporary notion of change and the unstable. So I'm happy that it's there in Manchester right now, floating that question.
Um, we have about 10 minutes to go. So I think it's also a moment, whoever feels like joining the conversation and sending us any question. As I said at the beginning, there is a little Q&A box where you can do that. And while we wait for that, I'm also interested now, you mentioned kind of the context of the pandemic. And I was also thinking how, in a way, also now this works. Uh, I don't know, did you have a sense that there was like maybe more demand or more interest with them? Because they also, you were mentioning bridges, they did become somehow also a really important, kind of bridge between the institution, that in some ways they could kind of be hosted by a certain, space which still belongs to art. It could go somewhere else. But it does for me, they were a little bit kind of also this light objects in the dark times. So I'm also wondering, do you think that the reading and also somehow the distance we had to art in so many ways, did it change a bit for you, kind of the sense of these works?
Yeah, I mean, it did. I mean, I think, one thing to say is that there were certainly, you know, more invitations in the last 18 months or so. And there's been a lot of projects that I've realized, in this autumn period. Um, and a lot of them are projects that have been, in a sense, under discussion for, a year and a half, 2 years or so. So it's not all just arriving like that,
Mm,
but there is a slow process whereby things are sort of coming into being. But I do think that the pandemic has, well, it kind of encouraged people to think about doing things in public space and outdoors, um, because regular kinds of programming and uh, exhibitions and performances and so on were difficult to realize. Like, so for example, I'm just going to share one other image actually, if I can do it. Is it going to let me? Yeah. Um, I need to do this in a very particular way. Um,
because I was also thinking, just, I can talk from a personal, commission, like the songs about being free. Of course,
mm,
also in the pandemics, I mean, for so many months, they were our only kind of public contact in terms of art, with the
yeah,
audience. And also on the other hand, I think it was interesting how the kind of the context completely changed, because as you were also saying, suddenly I think there was no one who didn't kind of ask, okay, what is the freedom, there? So
yeah,
suddenly
yeah.
the question of freedom became so much heavier and somehow
Mm, mm,
so much more urgent in terms of
mm,
how do we see it.
mm.
Sorry, this
This
was just
this
a
was
little.
this is just was an invitation from last summer for
Uh-huh.
a theatre festival in Zurich, who basically were not doing, 9/10 of their program or
Mm,
3/4 of their program. But I proposed this, very large scale text installation for the site where the festival normally
mm-hmm,
has, many theatres built and so on. So there was definitely a sense in which these works were, some of them were, coming in at that moment, in high points of the pandemic, to to be part of programming where other kinds of programming were not possible. Yeah.
and also now, when you were going through the slideshow, I know there are some other examples, but we only saw the one in French. So I'm also wondering about this issue of translation, because there is always, I mean, I've been also reading your books, there is such a precision in your language. So a little bit, if you can say, how do you deal with this issue of translation, and when does another language come in? Is it like by demand or by kind of your decision?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some places, I've done a few works in non-English, in other languages, and I'm not a linguist, so I must say that's always a process of working with other people on translation. And I think it's only really possible where I feel like the proposal from me is sufficiently, in one sense, straightforward that you really can do a translation that makes sense. I think there's a lot of the works would really struggle in translation because they rest on extremely idiomatic English or other sorts of turns in English that aren't necessarily possible in other languages. But in the case of Qu'y a-t-il for Centre Pompidou, I did a bunch of works in Lisbon, working closely with a good friend who's a native Portuguese guy, and he was translating, but also I was talking with him about the development of the work, and it was the same at Pompidou as well. I worked very closely with Chloe, who's the performing arts curator there. We were open to the idea that maybe in the end it had to be in English, but with the work that I arrived at, we felt like actually the translation options were good, so we went that way. I did some work in Riga this year, which was made in Latvian, and again out of a dialogue with another person. So I think that's the way that I tend to do it. Is it's not so much as sending a work to a translator. It's more like saying there's a dialogue partner with me in a process, and we go back and forth over a month or two with ideas, and that person can say that idea doesn't really translate, that idea's got a very particular connotation in Latvian that you don't want. So I like that. It's been interesting for me to work on those things. But of course I'm more comfortable just working in English because that's where I can feel what I'm doing. The tricky thing with the translated works is that I sort of have to rely on other people to tell me what I'm doing, which slightly weird.
We have 2 questions from the audience and not so much time. So, even 3. So now you will have to do, no, 4 for 6 minutes. Tim, this is now really have to be a precise one. Maybe I'll start with the first one from Jay. Do you have a sense of your own political responsibility for placing words in public space? Are there any examples where this has been more heightened than meanings connected with, say, linguistics play or obvious resonance?
Yes, I mean, I always think politically about the works, and I always feel like what I'm trying to do is put work in public space that opens questions, opens uncertainties, points towards the kind of tensions and fractures in the situation and in the society that we're in. They don't tend to be polemical as works, but I think I spend a lot of time thinking about them in terms of, I suppose, what kinds of questions and uncertainties they might be able to sort of reach towards. That, for me, that goes also with this idea of the openness of the work. For me, that's also, there's a politics in that, in the sense that it's not about me telling the work on the whole. It's about opening a space in which one's expecting and hoping that other people will do work. So yeah, I think that's always hugely part of it. And sometimes that comes really from context also. I mean, I'm working on a piece right now for Durham, for the former headquarters of the Durham miners, which was built in 1912, and at the time when there were 200,000 miners in Durham. So I'm thinking a lot about that particular context and what I want to put there.
Okay. There is also a question from Ronak. He's interested in the way that your works tend to often frame a temporality. And what is your position vis-a-vis permanence and legacy?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. They do often, because of this interest in the moment of encounter, works do point to temporality in that way, sometimes very explicitly. Um, uh, it's interesting because a number of the pieces have been, acquired and installed as permanent pieces in public space, which with neon or in general, I think it's never permanent. Everything's always destined to be removed or vandalized or moved at some point. And with neon, I'd say there is a sort of shelf life to things. It depends a little bit on how much people are willing to work with and invest in maintaining and keeping work in place. I suppose I like the fact that these works have a fragility and a temporariness. They're not. I don't think they're designed to last forever. I think they're gestures in space and time. You could put the resources into keeping them there, but I think that's more about the social and institutional will than the sort of permanence of the materials in a way.
And a question from Dylan. In such a chaotic world, to feel there has been or should be a change in the responsibility of artists to be aware of the social, political, and environmental conversations, to be engaged in them, to shape them, to participate in them? Or is the process of art making and the actions of an artist enough?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that all of those things are important, and I think in my own work, uh, I have very specific ways that I'm working, but I feel like as the years go by and as the situation that we're in intensifies in the ways that it has been doing, I feel more and more like the work needs to find ways to reach into those conversations and to connect to those conversations and to open the kinds of questions and thinking about possibilities that seem more and more important and more necessary. For me, it doesn't necessarily mean that the work again needs to adopt a sort of polemical role, because I have my doubts, I suppose, about the efficacy of that in terms of how it lands on other people. But I do think that it's super important to me that the work continues to open space and questions responsibly in this in the context that we're in, for sure. I mean, that's was always true, but I think the urgency of that regards so many of the issues that we're facing, climate change being one of them, but so many of them. It's more and more urgent, I think.
Thanks a lot, Tim. I have 10 more, but I think we'll just have to kind of wrap it up here. Thank you everyone for joining, and I'm certain there are many more of these works to come, and I hope there will also be another chance to continue the conversation. And also for those in Manchester, we would also like to recommend to still join. There is a final event of Corridor of Light. And of course, don't miss to go and see the neon installed. Thanks a lot, Tim.
Thank you, Sabina. Thanks so much for chatting to me today. And thanks to everybody at Corridor of Light, Maria especially, Jason today for hosting the technical side of the Zoom. It's really appreciated. And thanks to everybody for listening and for the questions as well. It's appreciated.